Hi, Daniel here, and here's the first video in how to really be as successful as you can be in the IELTS speaking test. And a couple of things that I want to say here just before we get into a lot of the nuts and bolts and the mechanics of the IELTS speaking test. The first thing to say is that the IELTS speaking test is repeatable. And what that means is that every single IELTS speaking test is done according to the same kind of structure. It's pretty predictable in that way. And this is why it's such a huge benefit to be able to prepare for it, to be able to kind of understand that these elements are repeatable. They are things that come up again and again. So when I talk about a lot of these things, they're not just abstract aspects that come up that, might be completely random. A lot of these aspects and features are completely repeatable. The second thing to say is that the examiner wants the candidate to pass. So when it comes to being in the room with the examiner, whether it's physically or virtually in the case of an online test, the examiner wants the candidate to pass. So with that in mind, let's dive into the three parts of the IELTS speaking test, the structure and how they look. So the test is timed, and the timings are identical for every test that is run. But of course, every examiner has their own little variability on how they run a test. Part one is basically like small talk. Imagine meeting a friend in a cafe and you're both on a lunch break. You don't have a lot of time to be able to kind of explain what's going on with you, your thoughts and feelings and all that kind of stuff. But you have just enough time to answer the questions in a, quick and easy and light way without extending too far or like trying to build up too much background knowledge. That's a good goal to look at for part one. And the reason for that is based on timings. The timings of part one for the IELTS speaking test are a minimum of 4 minutes, maximum of 5 minutes. But in that time, the examiner has to introduce themselves. They have to ask for the candidate's name. The candidate gives their name. Then the examiner has to ask for the candidate's identification. This could be a passport, a national ID, something that proves that they are who they say they are. The examiner then has to check that document against the ID number on their list, make sure that the name is also spelled correctly. This takes a few seconds just to make sure everything is correct. Then the examiner takes the ID photo and picture on the ID and double checks that the photo on the ID matches the candidate in front of them. This should all have been done already, but it is done again in the exam room just to doubly verify that the candidate taking the test is the one who booked and paid for the test. After that, the identification is returned to the candidate and the exam can begin, but all of that is included in the timings of part one. After that, the questions for part one are broken into 3 frames. The first frame has 3 questions, and they are always connected to either where the candidate lives or what the candidate does. This is known as the first frame. There are only 2 possibilities here, either where you live or what you do. This is great to know because the test has a 50-50 chance of starting one way or the other, and so it's very preparable from a candidate's side to get ready for that. After that, there are 2 more frames that come up. The first frame will have 4 questions in it. This can be something very general and everyday, something very light, and there are many frames that are available online to look at to see what they could be. But the general theme is small talk and focused on the individual themselves. The second frame has a minimum of 1 question, maximum of 4, and eventually that will lead to the examiner's discretion saying how long it will be until they will move on to the next part of the test. Every examiner is different. Some examiners want to give all 11 questions, and some examiners are happy with 8 or 9 or 10. It depends on the individual in the room, but it also depends on the candidate's response level. The candidates who are typically at a lower level or production of a lower level will actually get more questions because the examiner will probably have less reliance on them to actually spend the amount of time on a full answer. Candidates at high level might get fewer questions, but again, it depends on the examiner themselves. But in terms of putting that all together, maximum of 11, minimum of 8 questions, plus the ID check, plus the examiner having to ask any clarification questions or anything like that. A good piece of advice for a candidate is to aim for between 15 and 20 seconds per answer. This gives enough time that the examiner probably would not ask the question why to their answer, but it also ensures that the examiner does not have to interrupt their answer as well. And based on the fact that most people in general in English take about 5 seconds on a sentence, and if you don't believe me, watch this video, then basically 3 or 4 sentences is a good amount to train a candidate for being able to be ready for this test in part 1. That's a good model to have, and it's a good approach to take. It's not too heavy, it's not too light, and something that I definitely recommend is almost self-timing or timing a candidate in that. And if they don't speak for that amount of time, follow up with the question why. And if they speak for too long, I almost perform what's called a verbal fire alarm, which is if the candidate starts speaking too long, here is the verbal fire alarm to show them that that is too much time. That's essentially part 1 in a nutshell. It's pretty easy, it's pretty light, and most examiners do not really have the opportunity to evaluate too deeply into a candidate's response because there's just not enough time in the answers themselves, and just the structure of the questions is so closed that there's not enough time to do that. Moving on to part 2, this is often the most anxiety-provoking part of the test for many candidates, and it is a common cause of questions for IELTS teachers to help a candidate in this moment. So the first thing to say is that the whole frame or the whole section of part 2 is between 3 and 4 minutes, minimum 3 minutes, maximum 4. That includes 1 minute of preparation time, of which the candidate may take the whole minute or they may choose to not take the whole minute. It also includes the brief instruction time before that. This typically, for most examiners, takes between 20 and 25 seconds to deliver. Then the 2 minutes production itself. The 2 minutes is something which the candidate is given, but the understanding is that if a candidate is unable to sustain beyond a minute, there are fallback mechanisms in place. So a couple things to say here is that if a candidate is silent for 5 seconds consecutively at any point during the 2-minute recording, the examiner has to follow up with a question such as, can you tell me anything more about that? At this point, the candidate hopefully is provoked into giving more language, or the examiner might, again, if there's another 5-second pause, have to follow up with another question just to get the candidate talking again, hopefully to a point where more language is produced. If this has happened a couple of times and it's clear that the candidate just is not able to continue, at this point, probably the examiner would have the discretionary judgment to stop the candidate at that point and then go to the follow-up questions. Again, these follow-up questions are optional. A lot of examiners like to use them at least once regardless, but in the case of a candidate not filling the time, they would absolutely be used there to be able to kind of like help the candidate fill more time and give more language. In the case of the candidate who speaks for 2 minutes uninterrupted, the examiner stops them and either gives a follow-up question or doesn't. In the case of several examiners I know personally, they just don't. There's not enough time and there's so relatively little linguistic value to the question itself that they don't bother, but other examiners do. They follow the rules of the handbook that says a candidate should technically get a follow-up question even though it's optional. Preparing the candidate for both variants is a great way to go about that. Also, in terms of using the minute of preparation time, I would definitely say that candidates who use the minute preparation time tend to come into the part two with a better performance. They're more relaxed, they're more prepared mentally. Those who try and rush it tend to hit a wall more quickly. And I definitely don't advise candidates to not use the minute, because essentially it's a breather. So why would you deprive yourself of much needed mental headspace to attack what is for many candidates the most difficult and stress-inducing part of the test? Beyond that, part two is pretty straightforward, because it's a given topic with prompts on the page. The prompts on the page are a good fallback, honestly. I wouldn't typically advise candidates to attack them right away, but they're good if a candidate gets stuck or needs a secondary idea. They can really help. Apart from that, I think that part two is reasonably straightforward, and there's a lot of examples online of how part two can be executed effectively. So we'll leave it there for now. Part three is the follow-up to part two, and it is between 4 and 5 minutes, minimum 4 minutes, maximum 5. And here is the biggest variability in the whole test, because technically the examiner can ask a minimum of 4 questions and a maximum of 12. Bravo. Like, it's a very difficult dilemma and balance to reach between those two. Ultimately, the biggest determinant of that is candidate level. The higher the candidate level, the fewer questions they ought to face in part three. 4 is the minimum amount that's allowed. That would be 3 from the first frame and 1 from the second frame. But typically an examiner would like to ask at least 5 or 6, like at least, to provide a sample opportunity of different language options. The other alternative is for lower level candidates who genuinely are having a hard time sustaining an answer or being able to produce language at length. Then this is where each individual question, 3 in frame 1, 3 in frame 2, have a backup question embedded in them. And so part 3 can play out like part 1 in that case, where just 3 or 4 sentences and the next question comes would suffice to get to the end of that part. There's also an aspect where the individual examiner has discretion over that. They ultimately can decide how long an answer should be for them to feel comfortable. In general, in my experience, longer than part 1 but shorter than part 2 is a good approach. I'd almost call this like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears technique. You know, for some examiners, part 1 is too short and part 2 is too long, and part 3 is just right. That's certainly how I would approach it when teaching to candidates, aiming to double what was produced in part 1 is a good amount of time spent on an answer, and that should probably lead to 7 or 8 good answers that enable the candidate to showcase their language, but they're not too pressurized to like rush and cram a tiny answer into a hole because they don't have enough time to really expand upon what they're saying. These are all just simple things to bear in mind. There are a lot of other aspects to the IELTS speaking test in terms of mechanics and nuts and bolts, but the fundamentals of structure are fixed. And I think these would be really good for IELTS teachers to go through with candidates to explore in more detail. I love having questions about this kind of stuff, and I love helping both candidates and IELTS teachers grow and develop. So if you have any other questions about this, feel free to reach out and let me know, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for taking the time to watch this, and speak soon.